Thank you for coming to our InfoBites series, bite-sized learning over your lunchtime. And today we will be talking about searching for clinical practice guidelines. I am Erica Wright. I'm a librarian based out of the Glenrose Rehabilitation Library in Edmonton, and I will be leading this session today. So again, thank you for coming to this series. We're really happy to have you with us today. And just note that the session will be recorded and made available on the Library Services website at a later date. And we really encourage your questions on this topic, so please feel free to add them to the chat box. We will have a short Q&A period following the presentation. If we don't get to your question, then we will make sure to follow up with you. And we welcome your feedback. My lovely colleague Josette, she put the survey in the feedback, and we'll try to remember to put it in at the end. So please do share with us your thoughts on these sessions. And I would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on historical and contemporary Indigenous lands, including the territories of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and the homeland of the Métis, Regions 1 through 6. We also acknowledge the many Indigenous communities that have been forged in urban centers across Alberta. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into it with our bite-sized session objectives. So today, we are going to learn tips and tricks to use when searching for guidelines, strategies on how to think about searching, and learn about some important resources that you can use when you're searching for guidelines. And clinical practice guidelines, they are kind of like a multifaceted topic, and this is a high-level session about searching for guidelines and some strategies for searching. So there may be things that you'd like to know that are not covered in this session, or maybe some blind spots that I have. So please do reach out if there are things that you would like to discuss. Either you can reach out to me or Library Services. And all of the resources that we discussed today are listed on the Library Services Guide and our Standards and Guidelines Guide. So Josette has added that to the chat. You can take a look at it now or take a look at it later. So let's start with a definition to get us on the same page. Clinical practice guidelines are statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care that are informed by a systematic review of evidence and an assessment of the benefit and harms of alternative care options. So this definition, it comes from an Institute of Medicine report, and it's a widely cited document. And so you might have seen it before. In addition to providing guidance on what are trustworthy guidelines, it also goes over some of the challenges of producing and using guidelines. So if you would like to learn more about these aspects of guidelines, then this document is a really good place to start. And this definition emphasizes that guidelines are a specific type of document and are important tools in healthcare decision-making to help clinicians understand the trade-offs in patient care. Okay, so who might be looking for guidelines? So before we talk about looking for guidelines, who might be looking for them? So the kind of the first group in the way I look at it are policy writers, researchers, guideline developers, and they are looking to understand standard of care for writing policy, informing their research, or developing guidelines of their own. So they are often looking across a large breadth of guidelines across many jurisdictions to understand standards of care. And the other group is frontline staff, and they are using guidelines for direct patient care and how they can best make clinical decisions. So the guidelines that frontline staff use, they will be influenced by their context, by organizational policy. And often when we work with AHS frontline staff at library services, it will be to help them find it or access a specific guideline for their work or for their professional learning. So we're not going to discuss this organizational context in too much detail given the time we have today, and we're kind of more exploring the larger guideline context. But I just wanted to point out one important resource developed by the Clinical Knowledge and Content Managed program at AHS. So the Clinical Guidance Viewer, where you can find guidance developed and approved for provincial practice. So I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. So I will add that one. But that was just kind of a little disclaimer so you can know a bit the scope of today's session. Okay, so now we can get into kind of the crux of the presentation. How do we find guidelines? And what are some repeatable strategies that we can use to identify guidelines? So I sometimes say that looking for guidelines is a bit of a treasure hunt. So before I search for guidelines, I always go through a process of creating a little roadmap or mental model for myself. And these questions, they can help us understand some of the unique aspects of clinical practice guidelines and how this impacts how we search for them. Okay, so number one, who might publish on this topic? So when someone asks me to look for guidelines, probably the first thing I will do is I will go through a process with them of thinking and listing who might publish guidelines. So on their topic. So guidelines are usually produced by governmental organizations and professional societies. So a governmental organization could be like the Canadian Task Force on Preventative Healthcare. A professional society could be the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology of Canada. And another kind of thing we'll talk about is guidelines are produced by groups all over the world. So what jurisdictions, what countries might be relevant to this question? So that's kind of the first thing that I'll do. And the second question, where might they publish their guidelines? So where might the guidelines be published? And this is the key thing in searching for guidelines and really what makes them kind of challenging to find. And really, this is the main objective of our session today. So guidelines can be published in a journal. So sometimes the professional society's own journal or other scholarly journals. They might be on the guideline producer's website. So sometimes they just host their guidelines only on their website, not in a journal. And sometimes the guideline producers, they deposit them in a special guideline repository. So with this in mind, this is why our search has to take multiple approaches if we want to identify all relevant guidelines. And the final thing, and this one's a really important one, is what is the context for your topic? Is it potentially multidisciplinary? So different disciplines may cover different aspects of your topic. So that'd be different guideline producers. So if you have a rehab question, it might be covered by physical therapy associations, but it also may be covered by an association that covers the condition or disease of interest. So something like the Heart and Stroke Foundation. So these context questions circle back a bit to that who question we asked right off the bat. But the other context question I will always think about is it potentially embedded in a larger context? So this can be a tricky part. If we have a specific question that we're looking for guidelines on, they may be embedded in a larger guideline. And this has been something that I've encountered many times, where looking at maybe a larger disease or maybe a larger surgical guideline will have the more specific needed information in there. So you might have to search more broadly and look through these guidelines to check for subtopics. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but it's a little window into my mind. So just kind of some of the things that I will ask before I start searching. And then we get to the fun part, at least for nerdy librarians, where to search for guidelines. So we're going to go over 4 places where we can search for guidelines. We can look at point of care tools. So we'll look at that. How can we use point of care tools to find guidelines? We can look at article database for guidelines published in journals. We'll look at guideline repositories. And we'll take a quick look at how do we approach looking at individual guideline sites. So we're going to take an overview look at these 4 places. So it'll be just an overview, very quick in a way, but so the library can help you if you need further support with any of these tools or any of these strategies. Okay, so this will be our first stop, point of care tools. And point of care tools, they synthesize in a concise manner current best available evidence for rapid consultation at the point of care. And the 2 main subscriptions that library services has for AHS staff are DynaMed and then our Lippincott tools, Advisor and Procedures. And my colleague last week, Deanna, she highlighted DynaMed as a resource for evidence-based practice. And today we're going to take a little bit more of a look at it for looking for guidelines. But just a quick differentiation between point of care tools and guidelines. So the similarity is that both guidelines and point of care tools are developed to support evidence-based practice. The difference, point of care tools, they cover a broad range of topics and use the best available evidence. So that may include guidelines, whereas guidelines are a specific topic and follow a specific methodology. But clinical practice guidelines can often be found in point of care tools reference lists. So we're going to take just a quick look at that. Okay, so as I mentioned, DynaMed is one of our key point of care tools. And you can access it through library services. But one kind of nice thing is the DynaMed review team, they maintain a list of guidelines available on different topics. And so, like I said, this is probably my first stop when I'm looking for guidelines. I'll do a search and see if they have a related entry. And then I will kind of go to the section that is labeled guidelines and resources, and then go through those. And they've kind of curated an international list of guidelines on the topic. So it is a very great place to start and a good place to find guidelines. Okay, our second stop, our second strategy. So as I mentioned, a lot of guidelines are published in journals. And so when I'm looking for guidelines for you, I will always search in databases. So that would be like Medline, PubMed, CINAHL, Embase, to see if I can find guidelines there. And we can create and use kind of pretty detailed search filters to identify guidelines on your topic. So that's a little plug for us. Check with us if you want help with a guideline search in one of those databases. But most databases have kind of like a quick filter. So you'll see the little screenshot. I know it's pretty small, but hopefully you can get a sense. That is from PubMed, and they have a guideline filter built in. So you can just click the box and it'll filter for guidelines, and it does an okay job. But I will just note in the PubMed filter, you will just have to click on additional filters to add the guideline filter. So searching in those kind of databases is definitely important. But one kind of article database that I wanted to point out that is a bit unique is TRIP. And so TRIP is for turning research into practice, and they are an evidence informed tool or evidence-based tool. And it's a little bit unique because it searches across scholarly journals, but the TRIP team also manually look for guidelines published outside of journals. So let's take a look. I just have another screenshot for you of this interface. So it's a very simple search box. So you can just kind of put your search in, and it's a very simple search box. And then the filters on the side are specifically set up so you can filter for guidelines and for even from different countries or jurisdictions. So it's really designed to search for guidelines, and you'll find both ones published in journals and not published in journals. So it's kind of a little bit of a bonus resource. And after DynaMed, looking in TRIP is probably the second place I'll look. Okay, so we're already at our third spot, and that is guideline repositories. And guideline repositories, they contain guidelines from different producers. These are two large repositories, and the ones that I always check, they have a kind of an international representation of guidelines. ECRI, they took over for Guideline Clearinghouse. Guideline Clearinghouse has been gone for quite a while, but they took over for them. And they provide details for how they include guidelines in their repository, and they include the trust scorecard for appraising the guideline. And that's in accordance with the National Academy of Medicine standards. So if you think back to our first slide, that definition, that is where that trust scorecard comes from, the guidelines we can trust study. And GIN, it is the largest guidelines repository, the Guidelines International Network. They're not quite as explicit about how they include guidelines in their appraisal process, but they have a team that works on this. And it's another one I always check. So there are other repositories. I just wanted to highlight a couple that could be useful. Broad or specific focus. So Guideline Central is another broad one, but the American Physical Therapy Association, they have a repository of physical therapy guidelines that they produce, but also ones they do not produce. So kind of making that kind of list can be helpful because they do that intentional work of trying to create a comprehensive collection of guidelines. Okay, so now our last stop. And usually by this point, most of the unique guidelines that I find, they will be retrieved by this point, because I've looked in several resources that do the work of collecting guidelines. So at the beginning of this little process, I mentioned the first thing I'll do is make a list of individual guideline producers. And really what I'll do at the end is double check that no important or significant guidelines were missed. And sometimes I only find guidelines by looking at producers' website, but generally those other resources will do the trick. So guideline producers can be discipline specific or disease specific. So little shout out to AHS our own cancer guidelines, or have a broader scope. So that could be like the NICE guidelines for the NHS in the UK. And the Canadian Medical Association, they curate a list of individual Canadian guideline producers, and then they have a few of the larger international producers. So this is a really great source. And then a little shout out to library services. We have our subject guides, and each of our subject guides have a section for discipline-specific guidelines. So you can check those and feel free to reach out with suggestions if you see we're missing anything. So that is kind of the process I take. I will usually check DynaMed. I will then go to Trip, and then I'll search in somewhere like Medline or PubMed, and then go to my guideline repositories and check the important guideline producer website. So by that point, we're exhausted, but hopefully we've found all the guidelines that we need. So that is the essence of my session, and I'll just have a few closing things, but I wanted to again just remind you that everything that we talked about today is on our standards and guidelines guide, so you can go check that out. And Josette just put the survey back into the chat, so please provide any feedback you have. We really welcome it. And I'll just mention just a little teaser. We didn't talk about appraising that, but there are appraisal tools that you can use. So I'll just you can look at the slides if you're interested in that. I won't go into that so we can get to the questions, but just wanted to sneak that in. And we have another session next week, and that is on by my lovely colleague Rachel, and it is about how literature searching is a partnership and how you can support us and we can work together to make the best searches possible. And my final slide is just to come visit us in person. We love visitors. So if you are in a center that has a library, then we would love to see you. So thank you all very much for attending today.